Hey, Charlie, it's Jonathan. We know we're going to stipulate up front that he shouldn't have had these documents, whether they were classified or not. Having said that, certainly the word classified garners extra attention, particularly with some reporting that it might have even been some nuclear secrets were part of what the former president had at Mar-a-Lago. And there's sort of the sense out there that the president has broad powers to declassify. Well, you wrote an article that is helpfully titled Presidential Power to Declassify Information Explained. So please, if you could explain what can he or can he not do?
Sure. Well, so the important caveat here going into this question is whether it matters. And it doesn't matter for legal purposes because all three of the criminal laws that the Justice Department is basing this investigation on, according to the search warrant, do not depend on whether mishandled government documents are technically deemed to be classified. Two of them don't even have anything to do with national security. So the whole question of whether these were classified or technically secretly declassified by some standing order that no one knew about is a gigantic diversion in terms of the legal troubles that Trump may be in here. That said, the president does, it's just interesting, right? This question of, could you have such a standing order? What if the president in his head says, this document is declassified, but never tells anyone? This is what John Bolton was getting at. It raises interesting, almost metaphysical questions. The president does ultimately control the classification system. It's a product of executive order that stems from the president's power as commander-in-chief. And it exists in parallel and separate from, for the most part, legal controls on disclosure of national security secrets or theft of government documents that Congress has set up. So the Espionage Act predated the classification system, makes no reference to it, and that's why if you violated it, saying, well, I technically declassified it is not going to help you. The president can declassify anything he wants. There's an unanswered question, unanswered by any Supreme Court ruling, about whether the president can disobey the normal procedures that are part the rest of the executive branch has to follow in declassifying information. And the nuclear secrets you bring up are a special case because that information is protected by statute. Congress has set up a system for nuclear information. It's actually not called classified. It's called restricted data. And under Congress's statute, if it's nuclear stuff, the Energy Department and the Defense Department have to be involved in decisions about whether to lift restrictions on that data, although the president is the ultimate decider if they disagree. We don't actually, our reporting has not yet matched the Washington Post that there was nuclear information in these documents, but if there were, that would add another wrinkle to the mess.
Yeah, and that's a big if. We just don't know right now. So Michael, you've been looking to the national security implications of all of this, talking to people who have obviously spent their life concerned about the national security implications of this. What can you tell us?
Well, on the one level, they've got Trump now. They could bring charges against Donald Trump this week if they chose to. On the obstruction count and probably one or two more of the others, he takes documents that didn't belong to him. He gets subpoenaed to return those documents. He returns 15 boxes, or 15 boxes are returned. And then the FBI finds that he didn't return everything, and he returned. Finally, they do the search and they get 11. On that, they've got him. They could bring charges on obstruction. He didn't adhere to the subpoena he got. But that's not the end of the analysis. There's a lot more that goes into this. There are questions. We did an interview with Mary McCord, who was chief of the National Security Division last week, who pointed out that often intelligence agencies are reluctant to let the Justice Department bring criminal charges that would require them to declassify some of this material in order to present it in court. There is that. But I think the more important one is the question that Carol was raising. Does the FBI have evidence for what Trump's motive was in retaining those 11 boxes of documents as opposed to the 15 he did return? Was there something he was planning to do with them? Was he going to share them with anybody? That goes to the sort of level of criminal intent here. And right now, we don't have the answer to those questions. And it may not be anything other than the kind of reckless contempt that Trump has for the norms that was that explains all this. And if they don't have that criminal motivation to do something with the documents, I think the more likely route here, Justice Department isn't going to drop it, is there's a misdemeanor charge that could be brought. That's what they did with David Petraeus when he shared highly classified documents with his biographer. That's what they did with Sandy Berger when he took classified documents from the National Archives. That's what they did with John Deutsch when he took classified material home with him after he was CIA director. So there is a precedent here for going the misdemeanor route. But that would require Trump to consent to plead to a misdemeanor. And I think that's where this gets really dicey as to whether or not Trump would ever do that and basically dare the Justice Department to try to go the felony route.
Yeah, I don't think that's a dare he's going to want to make. Merrick Garland appears determined to see this to its legal conclusion. Miki, it's the deep irony here, of course, on Michael just brought up, of course, David Petraeus, and Deutsch, former CIA Director Deutsch, and also Sandy Berger. One of the reasons Donald Trump did not select David Petraeus as Secretary of State when he was looking at him was he mentioned this. He mentioned the fact that he had mishandled classified information, and there was just no way that either he nor the generals who were going to work for him could have any part of that.
Yeah, the question of intent, obviously, we'll let the investigation speak for itself when it does. But that's a big one. It obviously makes it far more serious if they find intent. But still, if these documents were in his possession illegally, no matter what, it's bad. You can't walk out with these documents. You just can't. You didn't, by mistake, stuff them in your pocket.